Hey guys, sorry if this one's a little bit later than usual, but yeah, let's just go ahead and jump right in. In any case, with this video, I'm going to be talking to you about Italian and German unification, and I'm going to be going through the key points, the main figures, and what it is exactly that you guys need to concern yourselves with. So, essentially, for Italian and German unification, you need to know a couple things. The first thing that you need to be familiar with is what Europe was like before the unification. Then, of course, you have to understand the different stages of the unification. And finally, you have to understand the key figures in each unification movement. So, in Italy's case, quite simply, Italy was a number of small states. They had their own language, their own culture, their own traditions. They weren't really unique, even when, they weren't really unified in any way. Even when unification happened, Cavour famously said, "We've created an Italy, now we just have to create Italians." So what really happened was that it was an effort to bring people together who weren't necessarily united. Now, what you have to understand is the French really had the biggest effect out of all of the European countries on Italian unification. So the story really starts with the French Revolution. During the French Revolutionary Wars, the French Revolutionary Army, led by Napoleon, would end up taking over several key territories in Italy. During this time, it would set up what is essentially the first prototype of the Italian Republic. So eventually Napoleon is defeated during the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and at the Congress of Vienna, Italy is divided again. Broadly speaking, the north, the middle part, and the south. Now the north is mostly Austrian territory. They either had territory that was outright theirs or territory that was more or less under their control. It was controlled by dukes, duchesses, or earls, or other small regional rulers that were pro-Austrian. The middle part, the Papal States, were run by the Pope, and the south was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and of course, it was ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, French monarchs. So here's the thing. Between 1815 and 1848, you have the first revolutionary Italian movements. These are small movements, and they're mostly disconnected from the populace. The general population was happy. They lived well enough, and they did okay for themselves. Well, not okay for themselves, they were mostly illiterate, but they didn't really care that much. So essentially you have small secret societies forming, like the Carbonari. And the Carbonari were a group of intellectuals that revolted against the government in several cases. These were small revolts, mostly with a couple hundred people leading them, sometimes armed, sometimes not, almost always ending in failure. So they had a vision of a unified Europe, but they were still the minority. Now, then you have the writings of Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a key scholar, and Mazzini really believed in the idea of a united Italy. But once again, there wasn't that much traction. So, with the election of a new pope in 1946, they believed there might be chances for liberal reforms because he seemed like he was a more open-minded pope. But ultimately, Pope Pius IX wouldn't really be as open to liberalism. It's debated. Some people say he was, but there was pressure on him not to be. Other people believe that the Italians were misguided and he really didn't want to help them. In any case, what happened was in 1848, several revolts happened throughout Italy, and these have varying levels of success. And Piedmont Sardinia tries to push out the Austrians. Eventually, what happens is the Austrians push back. They're still very good militarily in 1848. They lose. The Italians lose, sorry. Well, more importantly, the Piedmontese lose. The French end up taking over Rome again because they're Catholics. And what happened was Giuseppe Mazzini, with the help of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who we're going to come back to, had managed to take over the Vatican, and they set up a republic. And this wasn't really a good idea. So the French kicked them out, and of course, the revolts in the south of Sicily end up going sideways. So, lessons from 48 is that number one, if you want to fight the Austrians, you need a really good military force. Lesson number two, you need more support from the people. And lesson number three, you need to have a plan. So what happens is the man with the plan ends up being Camillo di Cavour. Now, Cavour was a member of the Piedmontese parliament, he was a very crafty man. He was able to negotiate between the left and right-wing members of the parliament. He was able to have a good grip of the situation. He was very diplomatic. And most importantly, he was good at getting what he wanted. So Cavour ends up becoming prime minister, and he begins his effort to expand Piedmont Sardinia. It's very important to make the distinction between revolutionary movements and what Piedmont Sardinia was doing, which was expansion. So the thing is, Cavour was trying to expand. And more importantly, he was actually trying to have a bigger sense of Piedmontese power. He wasn't really taken with the idea of a revolution or unification. These were ideas that didn't concern him in the same sense. So what happens past this point is that Cavour ends up making deals with other provinces. He makes deals with the French, most importantly, and he starts making inroads towards pushing out the Austrians. Now, the timing is very crucial, and probably the most significant event for Italy was the Crimean War. See, at the Congress of Vienna, the European powers achieved something that arguably they haven't been able to do since in the same way, which was all function in unison. You see, if you guys look at Versailles, you can see a very divided and very fractured Europe, whereas just 100 years earlier, in the Congress of Vienna, you had a unified Europe. Everybody was working towards the same goal. In the Crimean War, this is where you start seeing the cracks in the facade of European security and safety, and things really start going sideways for the Europeans. So France becomes less tight with Austria, and what happens is the Italians, the Piedmontese, exploit this, and they form a better relationship with the French. So, using better military training and aid with the French, which doesn't happen the same way that they need it to, they end up pushing out the French in a series of conflicts. They end up pushing out the Austrians in a series of conflicts. And they eventually manage to unify Italy. Now, the thing is, in the south, Garibaldi pulls up the rear, and here's the thing, Garibaldi and Cavour didn't like each other that much. Cavour was a monarchist. He wanted to support the king. He wanted there to be a kingdom of Italy, which there was in 1871. Garibaldi believed in the power of the people. He was a revolutionary and a republican. So essentially, the gains made by Garibaldi were taken by Cavour. And the thing is, Cavour had a risky play because Garibaldi pushed back and he didn't like the idea of what Cavour was doing. However, Cavour asserted himself, he put his foot down, and ultimately, what happened? Right, so what happened was there was two sides to it, Garibaldi in the south and Cavour in the north. Eventually, Cavour manages to take control of Italy as on the whole, and Garibaldi retreats from the political scene. And eventually, the Kingdom of Italy is formed in 1871. However, there are still major regional differences. The fact of the matter was, because a northern Italian kingdom wanted to take northern Italy for itself, this began a tradition of the north of Italy being more educated, industrialized, and successful, and the south of Italy becoming sort of the part that was more agricultural and less focused on by the government. So another thing to understand is that what Cavour did really to sort of make the rest of the Italian people want to be part of Piedmont was modernize Piedmont as much as possible. And the 19th century really, the later half, became a great time for Europeans because their rulers started to realize that if you want to have power, you can mix it with authoritarianism by essentially making sure that you give people modernization, reforms, a more democratic process. And this was something that Louis Napoleon had started in France earlier, and it ended up being the best solution because the cycle that had happened before was, putting your foot down and then inevitably the people getting up in arms and getting a lot more, aggressive. So, essentially, what happens in Germany is parallel to an extent in that the architect of German unification, as you guys know, was Otto von Bismarck. So, the thing is, Germany as a state had always kind of existed as a series of provinces. Much bigger, of course, there were 39 states, and the German Confederation was also created in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna. Congress of Vienna really is the key part for Europe. It's really the turning point for a lot of these countries. So essentially what happened was German nationalism starts getting more and more advanced at this period. Now the Germans, unlike the Italians, had much more nationalism. Their traditions weren't as distinct. They had the same language. They all spoke German. And it's important to make the distinction because, for example, in Italy, people spoke regional dialects that are actually pretty distinct. In fact, at the time of the Unification, the Risorgimento, less than 2 or 3% of Italians speak the language we now know today as Italian. So with the Germans, there was also literature that was really important. And with Prussia, they were the equivalent of Piedmont, Sardinia. The objective was also to take down the Austrians. So it wasn't a good century for the Austrians. This is really where they see their grip loosening on European states. The way that Bismarck was doing it, of course, was more militaristic. See, while Piedmont just focused on modernizing, liberalizing, and trying to take control through diplomacy and a mix of military, Bismarck really did feel that he needed to be more militaristic. So the first major step that Bismarck takes was trying to create a more unified Germany in terms of economic ties. And this creates the Zollverein. Now, the Zollverein was a customs-free union, and this meant that people could trade between German states without any real difficulty. So the idea of it was there was actually 39 different states, but now they could function more and they could cooperate more. So the idea was unification was going to happen, but the idea was that they wanted to try and produce it under Prussia rather than under Austria. So in 1848, unification was actually something that a lot of the people were calling for. So in Bismarck's case, it wasn't quite as hard. So Bismarck really faced three main nations as obstacles, and besides that he had the political obstacle of taking more power. So he makes the Kaiser a lot more assertive and he argues on his behalf, and this helps him form the North German Confederation. And he manages to get the parliament to back down and to create a much more conservative Germany. After this, he declares a series of wars, first against the Austrians, then against the Danish, and most famously against the Prussians, ending his quest for nationalism with the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. So the idea was the war with Austria was probably the most devastating one, 7 weeks war as it's known. And the war with Austria was really designed to get Austria to back down and to have a much smaller role in German diplomacy. So the thing is, Bismarck at the time wasn't really sure how the Austrians would react. His bigger concern was whether or not other countries would intervene. And once again, Crimean War, he was actually pretty lucky in that other countries didn't intervene to help the Austrians. So once the Austrians were gone, this was the biggest obstacle towards German unification under Prussia. After that, there was, of course, the Danish. That was a pretty minor campaign, and the French. So the real question is, why would Prussia and France go to war? The idea was France didn't like the idea of German unification. They didn't have any kind of vision for a united Germany, and the Germans did. So the thing is, the French actually believed they could expand their territory and they could start taking some of the neighboring German territories. So this is where Bismarck had a problem, and he tried to get a little bit more aggressive. He ends up provoking the French into declaring war, and he has a much more decisive advantage. His military was more prepared, more advanced, more developed, and this is really something that carries on into World War I. And the Franco-Prussian War ends with a devastating defeat from the French, heavy reparations paid, and ultimately the unification of Germany. So the differences between Italy and Germany in terms of unification are that Italy's unification was much more liberal. Camillo de Cavour was very favorable towards more left-leaning policies. And of course, that Germany's was more conservative. Italy used a mix of diplomacy and militarism, whereas Bismarck had a lot more focus on militarism. Besides that, really, you have to understand that Bismarck was much more focused on Prussian power and centrality. So he had a lot of emphasis on creating a more conservative German state. And this is something that endured a lot after 1871, after the country was formed. So that sort of gives you guys a basic overview of French and Italian unification. Thanks for watching.